Well, order. Welcome to this Treasury Committee session about the subject of economic forecasting. And we're very grateful to our excellent panel this afternoon for coming in and allowing us to scrutinise some of the challenges around economic forecasting and also the Chancellor's upcoming budget and headroom and the associated Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts. Before I ask our witnesses to introduce themselves, I just wanted to say that we're particularly grateful to you because we did also invite the OECD to come and talk to their UK forecast. We also invited the International Monetary Fund to come and speak to their forecast about the UK economy. And I'm very disappointed that scheduling did not allow the OECD to come. And I'm particularly disappointed that the IMF refused to come and discuss their forecast in public. We are very disappointed as a committee at their outright refusal to let us scrutinise their forecasts on the UK economy. They are a public body partly owned by the UK taxpayer, and we think they should come and give us evidence, as you kindly have agreed to today, on economic forecasting. So with our three eminent and very present in the room economists here, I'm going to ask you to start by introducing yourself, starting with yourself, Professor Bean.
Charlie Bean, these days Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, but formerly at the Bank of England as Chief Economist and then Deputy Governor, and then subsequently at the Office of Budget Responsibility on the Budget Responsibility Committee.
Yeah, thank you. Nina.
Nina Skero, I'm the Chief Executive of CEBR, the Centre for Economics and Business Research.
Thank you. And Jack.
I'm Jack Meenan. I'm the Chief UK Economist at Barclays.
And formerly at the Bank of England as well.
Formerly at the Bank of England.
Yeah. So I just want to start by establishing what your two forecasts are, and yourself, Professor Bean, if you have one, for what the growth of the UK economy will be this year and for what our rate of inflation will be over the course of this year. Does anyone want to share with me their forecast? Nina?
Of course. So we are expecting a growth in 2024 of 1.1%, which would be a pickup compared to last year, but still a historically relatively low rate of GDP growth. And in terms of our inflation forecast, we are expecting inflation to approach but not return to target of 2%. So by the end of 2024, we're expecting inflation to be around 2.2%, which is very, very close to target. And I will say, in terms of our inflation forecast, that is we are forecasting a lower rate of inflation than we would have been as recently as a few months ago.
Okay. Professor B, does LSE have a specific forecast?
No, I mean, I'm no longer formally in the forecasting game.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say as a sort of general narrative on the outlook that I would see output as continuing to pretty much flatline, possibly picking up a little bit as we go through the year. I would not treat the growth reading for the fourth quarter of minus 0.3 coming after minus 0.1 the previous quarter as indicative of us turning into a deeper downturn. Some of that sharp or sharpish fall at the back end of last year can be traced to a sharp fall in retail sales in December, which has completely unwound in the January numbers and is probably associated with the difficulties of getting the seasonal adjustment right when you've got Black Friday and discounting and January sales and those sorts of things. Purchasing managers' indices are consistent with modest expansion at the beginning of this year. And I don't buy the argument that there's a lot of past tightening still to work through as households with mortgages that have been fixed for a couple of years and are now resetting are suddenly waking up So the consequences, it seems to me plausible that they would have started adjusting their behaviour already. And the fact that pay growth slightly exceeds inflation will also help to sustain consumer spending up and hold it up. So I don't expect to see strong growth, but continued flattish.
Yeah.
And then on the inflation front, it's pretty much baked in that inflation will come back to somewhere near the target in the spring as large increases in the price level a year ago drop out of the annual comparison. But the real issue is not what's going to happen in the spring, but underlying inflation and what inflation will be further out. And I do see inflation picking up somewhat as we go through to the second part of the year. How high it goes will depend on particularly the evolution of pay.
Thank you. That same question to you.
Broadly, narratively, quite similar to Nina and Sir Charlie's kind of view of the outlook. So we have quarter-on-quarter growth pretty stagnant in the first quarter of this year. We don't think the recession carries on through more than just the two technical quarters that we had in the second half of last year. But we still have penciled in sub-trend growth in the UK all through this year. So this is an economy kind of ticking along and stagnating rather than accelerating to any real degree. And then that picks up from kind of 2025 onwards to actually be growth picking up towards trend, and by the end of 2025, then above trend. So the implication of that is we have an output gap opening up negatively in our forecast. We think there's already a negative output gap in the UK, and we think that widens all the way through this year, which brings with it disinflationary pressure. And as part of the reason, I would say the kind of the difference between the narratives between Nina and Sir Charlie and our own is we think there will be a more sharp disinflation through the course of this year. So we think actually come April, when the energy price cap changes, actually headline inflation drops lower than 2%, but then the underlying inflationary pressure essentially means that you have headline inflation below 2% all the way through the rest of 2024 and in through the first half of 2025, just coming back up to target around the second half of 2025. So we essentially have a view that underlying wage pressure, because there's slack opening up in the economy, because people are seeing headline inflation coming down, that wage pressure will actually moderate more quickly than, say, the Bank of England or arguably other panelists' views are. And that actually leads to a slightly softer view on prices going forwards.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I just wondered, given that we are a few weeks ahead of the Chancellor's budget, if you could also now share with us what you think is the characteristic of the fiscal rules against which the Chancellor measures UK performance. Who wants to start with that one? The fiscal rules themselves, do they make sense, the Chancellor's fiscal rules?
Do the rules make sense? I mean, the general principle that the debt to GDP ratio should be falling in good times makes sense. Basically, the big picture of public debt is it should go up in bad times, wars, pandemics, things like that. Big energy shocks if you're giving temporary support to households. And in return for that, you obviously have to make room in the good times to create the fiscal space for dealing with the next bad shock that comes along. And that is just sensibly sharing the burden.
That's not what the fiscal rule actually
says.
No,
the fiscal rule is to have the debt to GDP ratio falling 5 years out.
Yeah.
So I'm starting from what is basically a sensible objective. Then, of course, the way that is actually encoded is that the debt to GDP ratio 5 years out is supposed to be falling, and then the Chancellor typically keeps a small amount of headroom to that. Now, I do think the way that it tends to be pursued is not terribly sensible, in that it is very sensitive to where the OBR's forecast turns out to be. And, you know, if it moves 5 billion one way, then because the Chancellor is aiming to keep 15 billion or 20 billion or whatever of headroom relative to hitting that objective, then it immediately translates across into 5 billion room for some fiscal action. Given that the forecasts are very sensitive, borrowing is the difference between two large numbers in tax and spend, and relatively modest changes in assumptions about, say, where interest rates will go, or where prices and GDP will go, and the rate of productivity growth, can lead to that number moving around quite a lot. So personally, I think it would be desirable to operate the regime in a way that makes it less sensitive to the precise judgments that are embodied in the OBR's forecast. This is not a criticism of the OBR, it's an inevitable result of forecasting, that there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's a question about how you use that, and instead of trying to hit things pinpoint accuracy all the time, having a sort of fuzzier link, I think would make sense.
Yeah. Nina, do you have any different point of view than that?
I don't disagree on the principles of the fiscal rules. I do think the way in which they are applied at the moment makes them close to meaningless. On whether the 5-year horizon is the right length of time, I don't think that's necessarily, shortening that horizon would be the solution. I think as long as you have fiscal rules that just rely on a future date that can be rolling, whether it's 5 years or 4 years, I don't think it would make a big difference. And there have been many iterations of fiscal rules in not too long of a time span, and I understand the pros and cons of both. I think in terms of actually having a set of rules that the Chancellor sticks to, something that takes an annual view where every year or every normal year you're sort of meant to be getting closer to target, is a little bit easier to monitor.
Okay. Do the fiscal rules make sense to you, Jack?
I mean, I'd start by echoing what the previous two panelists have said, but I guess the bits that I would add on to there, one is that obviously no rule is perfect, and I think there are two specific issues with the current fiscal rules as they stand. One is the nature of just having a rule which is attached to a forecast. So if you look back at the OBR's forecasting performance, the OBR has by most measures, a very good forecasting performance. But 5 years into the future, their forecast for GDP are on average plus or minus 1 percentage point wrong on GDP growth. Now, when we're talking about headroom of 0.5% of GDP, forecast errors systematically of that kind of area can make quite a lot of difference. And that's not, again, as Charlie said, a criticism of the OBR. That is inherent in the nature of forecasting. So I think in that sense, having any rule that is attached to forecasts out into the future is problematic for that sense. You can't remove that uncertainty in any meaningful way. But the second thing is the specific fiscal rule at the moment, which is about what happens in the 5th year of the forecast as opposed to anything more short term. And that has the problem that it can be gamed in the sense that you can, it doesn't matter how high the level of debt has got, as long as you manage to engineer something in the forecast, which means it comes down in the future. And so to that extent, you can put in things that may never materialize, may stretch credulity in some senses, and suddenly meet your fiscal rule. Or you could have something which was eminently plausible, miss the fiscal rule, but because it wasn't in keeping with the fiscal rule as set, you then miss out on a policy that would have been useful. So I think those two differences are quite important.
And also, of course, it's ex-Bank of England impact, and the Bank of England impact is also quite significant these days. So given that we have heard that it is very difficult to predict with any certainty, let alone 5 years' time, I'm now going to ask you to all predict, nevertheless, which is to say, based on your estimate, how much quote-unquote headroom do you think the Chancellor has going into the upcoming budget Who wants to start with that? Jack, you were the one who nodded enthusiastically to my question.
Enthusiastic as ever. So an extra trick here from people like me in the private sector is what we're trying to forecast here is not what we think the future will look like, but what the OBR will think the future looks like.
Yes.
So we have crunched those numbers to forecast the forecast. With that kind of stated, we think broadly you've got about £19 billion of headroom, maybe a little bit less, given the fact that the yield curve has moved a little bit in the last day or so. But roughly £19 billion would be kind of commensurate with what we see as the OBR's changes to their forecasts, with a yield curve that is slightly lower, which reduces interest costs to the government, and with inflation coming down by more than you see a change in real GDP, which then means that nominal GDP comes down a bit, but also so do costs on index-linked bonds. So all of that means we think actually it expands from the roughly 13 billion we had last time to more like 19 at this forecast.
And obviously that's a mind-blowingly large sum of money for any individual, but just give us a sense of what that is as a percentage of the whole UK economy. It's not a very large amount, is it?
No, less than 1%. Less than 1%.
Yeah, thanks. Professor Bean, any difference of opinion on that?
No, it's a perfectly plausible number. The one thing I would say about these calculations is, having seen it from the inside, there can be a lot of moving parts that go into this. Now, there's some obvious things from the outside that you can look at that you will know will affect the potential fiscal headroom. So most obviously changes in the yield curve, and roughly speaking, if the yield curve the whole way along, short rates, long rates and so forth, falls by a percentage point, that creates, I think it's another 14 billion. If the price level is 1 percentage point lower, that loses you some tax revenues, but also in offset benefits would be lower because of the lower indexation. So those sorts of things from outside, you can take a punt at what they might add up to. But the thing is that there are other assessments that the OBR has to make. So insofar as tax revenues have turned out from different expectations, they will need to take a view, is this just temporary noise, or is it something permanent and persistent which will lead the level of tax revenues to be higher in the medium term. So those sorts of things from the outside, it's really very difficult to form a view on. Obviously there have been suggestions in the press that there may be not very much fiscal headroom left. Certainly if you go back a month or so ago, before the recent move up in interest rates, it would be reasonable to be thinking that there might be 10, 15 billion, something like that. That it does look as if it'll be rather less, but exactly how much, it's difficult to know. And there is, of course, a question about how much the Chancellor wants to keep as insurance, if you like, in headroom against further shocks.
And from your perspective of having worked within the OBR, and it is an iterative process, as you say, what's the point at which it all gets sort of locked in? Is it about a week before the budget?
Oh, it's further ahead than that in terms of the forecast, because the idea, so basically there's 3 iterations of the macro forecast and the associated fiscal numbers, which then get locked down. I've forgotten exactly how far ahead, 3 or 4 weeks, maybe, ahead of the budget day, so that the Chancellor has a stable base on which to work. The thing is, it's impossible for him to be making decisions if the base is continually moving around from one round to the next. So things get locked down after the round 3, as it's called, and then that helps the Chancellor's own planning.
Nina, do you have an estimate of how much headroom the Chancellor has?
Well, I imagine we've taken rather the same inputs and come up with a very similar figure of around 20 billion. I guess that is the figure I would expect sort of the Chancellor or something close to sort of mention as the estimate of the fiscal headroom, keeping, some of the more recent developments that I think add color to the sort of economic context. So we do have the data showing a mild but still a recession at the end of 2023. We actually think we're already out of that recession, but it's certainly not a position of economic strength. There was data out this morning, which I think the Chancellor would probably be happy with in terms of the messaging, in terms of how much headroom there is. So I think it will be a balancing act. I think there's a lot there that you could point to say that the economy is flatlining, and actually it would be prudent to try sort of rebalancing the position from the recent expenditure. On the other hand, you could also make the case that receipts have been exceptionally high so that there is a little bit of room. So I think it'll be a balancing act, but I agree fundamentally with what's already been said.
Thank you all very much. Angela.
Thank you very much. There's been increasing controversy about forecasting, and obviously the Bank of England are having the Ben Bernanke review into their forecast models. You're all forecasters. There are some who are saying that, or you have been forecasters in your view, but a very experienced one. To what extent do you think this is just grumbling about what the forecasts are saying? And to what extent do you think that forecasting can be defended as a process, or is it simply something that reflects the quite heroic, in some cases, assumptions that underlie the decision making in the forecast itself? Is it objective? Can it be something that we can take account of, or is it just a generated process which really the outcome of which is determined by the assumptions implied in it? It's a bit philosophical, but you know what I mean.
No, but there's actually quite a lot to unpack there. Firstly, it is important with forecasts to realise that you can't expect economic forecasts to be precise.
They're not predictions of the future.
They're not predictions. Now, of course, there's plenty of things where something might be well behaved, but you would never be able to predict it perfectly, like throwing a couple of dice. Your best prediction is a 7, but you wouldn't expect a 7 to come up necessarily that particular throw. It's only if you throw the dice lots of times, the 7 is the one that dominates. So there's always going to be a distribution around that. And some of the forecasting uncertainty is of that variety. On top of that, and this is where forecasts go more wrong very often, is that the nature of the things that happen are just not draws from a statistical distribution. The COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the financial crisis, and the possibility of the breakup of the Eurozone, for instance, those sorts of things, there's no basis for trying to calibrate what's the likelihood of this event happening. But nevertheless, forecasts can be useful. I think of forecasts as sort of quantitative stories, quantitative narratives. And the value of putting the quantitative in there is it stops you assuming things which are actually just implausible in terms of magnitudes. You have to have things that fit together sensibly. And the way models do that is essentially using past experience, past evidence to calibrate the size of relationships between different variables in the economy. And that, I think, is a useful exercise. And potentially it's a useful exercise not only for thinking about where we think the most likely broad trajectory of the economy is, but also thinking about the risks and the nature of the risks either side of that. And this is something we might come on to later.
I mean, I think that's a good summary, but let me ask, we're in a period at the moment, yes, we've had a lot of shocks, these exogenous shocks that models don't predict and forecasts can't predict. And we're also in a circumstance where we have to think about retooling our entire economy in order to deal with the threat of climate change, a kind of an existential threat which requires a re-engineering of the sort that we have not seen in a very, very long time, if ever. To what extent in that context do sort of forecasts that have been quite predictive and good guides in the past have relevance in the immediate and medium-term future?
Yeah, you have to be very careful about, or careful not to mindlessly apply a model which might have fitted at a particular period in the past to a conjuncture where it may no longer be relevant. What's very important with all economic models and forecasting and the like is to be aware of their limitations, and when you basically need to use a different toolkit, a different sort of model. And when you get into thinking about situations which are not really like those that you've encountered in the past and which your model might have been calibrated on, that's when you need to start thinking, well, how might the world be different? In what ways might it be different in this new setting? And that does require the analyst to go beyond simply, cranking their existing set of equations. So an obvious example of this, to take an example when I was at the OBR, was our first stab at trying to assess the impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns on the economy and on the public finances. Now, the existing Treasury model that the OBR uses could not effectively answer that question. So we were basically using other ways of approaching the problem, thinking about, how, with lockdowns, which sectors of the economy were likely to be shut, to what extent people could still trade even though they might not formally be able to open their shop, effective social distancing, all those sorts of things. So you need to look for other things to help you get a broad handle on the magnitudes that might be involved. And because you are in a world where you're it's not quite completely in the dark, but there's a lot of conjecture going on. You do need to be very conscious of the potential limitations of the analysis and appropriately humble. And
do you think that, given the underlying economic assumptions which have been part of the toolkit of economists for many years, are fit for the purpose in this new era? For example, the general view that lots of economists have, that perhaps what the relative balance of tax and fiscal policy and investment should be, for example, in an era like this where there needs to be a complete retooling. Does that imply that we need some updates in economic theory to deal with the kind of position we're in, or do the old models of small state or big state or
I would distinguish between the theory and the models. Okay, so
do not the models imply the theoretical and sometimes even theological economic beliefs in the way in which they work?
No, I mean the way I think of theory is it's a toolkit to use, and then a model will be a particular embodiment of that, which may be useful in some circumstances and not in others. And the hallmark of a good analyst, a good forecaster, if you like, is somebody who can identify the appropriate model for the particular issue that they want to look at. Now, I would suggest for the particular issue that you've raised, climate change and the challenges that are associated with that, that the general tools of economics and incentives and how households and businesses behave and respond to those incentives are going to be extremely valuable in understanding what the appropriate policy response is. You won't find that by looking aside the Bank of England's forecasting model or the OBR's forecasting model, but the tools of analysis and empirical work that people have done, which illuminate the strength of particular phenomena, may well be important. And it may well be important also to bring in insights from other disciplines too, because, I mean, obviously with climate change, you need to bring in insights from climate science. For understanding the effect of the pandemic, we needed to bring in insights from epidemiology. So you have to be appropriately Catholic in the information that you bring to bear. But as I say, I would emphasise the way to think about this is as a set of toolkit with a set of tools you can apply, and then the key is to be picking the right tools to use for the particular problem that you want to look at.
We have to be humble and Catholic, is what I get from that. I just wanted to ask about growth and productivity, both of which have disappointed enormously, and people will argue about the reasons for that, but I'm more interested in what we can do about it to improve it. Productivity continues to decline even though we have full expensing and a range of I think 120 growth measures, but growth still bumps along the bottom. What do you think, if you were Chancellor for a day, you'd want to be doing about those two very important issues?
Certainly what you want to achieve, if your objective is to increase growth, is to increase physical capital formation, both public and private, increase human capital formation, so that's education, skills acquisition, things like that, increase labour force participation, which of course is something the government has been trying to do recently. Some of the measures in the last couple of fiscal events have been focused on that, things like childcare, improving childcare provision. When it comes to the sort of the black box bit of it, which is you can increase the means of production, capital, labour, so forth, but then the magic factor is how they're combined into output, but sometimes referred to as the methods of production. Now, the big drivers of growth in living standards over many years is actually that magic factor, that black box, what economists refer to as total factor productivity. Unfortunately, the forces that drive that are not well understood. The slowdown in productivity that you referred to is essentially primarily driven by a slowdown in total factor productivity growth. It's not a UK-specific phenomenon. It's observed in many other countries as well. It's not associated just with the aftermath of the financial crisis, because it starts in the US in about 2003. In some ways it's puzzling because you think about all of the inventions that are taking place. We've got AI and advances in computing, nanotechnology, stuff like that. But it doesn't really show up in the the productivity numbers, or at least hasn't shown up yet. Because economists don't really have a good handle on what drives that magic factor, total factor productivity, that's an element which is much harder for us to act on. The one thing I would say from a UK policy perspective is it is very notable that it's not only that our productivity growth has slowed since around the time of the financial crisis, but also our relative productivity levels are disappointing, and they have been for a long time. And that can be traced very specifically to low investment rates in both public and private capital, and educational attainment and skills, at least for the bulk of the workforce, which are not as good as they could be. So in terms of where you focus your policy, I think it is sensible to be focusing on the bits that we know we might have some ability to influence, and where we know we lag compared to other countries.
Can I make an observation about that, because I don't disagree with you at all. But capital formation, public and private, and human capital formation, which is essentially education, skills, however acquired, relies a lot on public investment. Obviously, the private sector invests when it feels that it's going to make a profit, and it feels upbeat about the prospects of that being a successful investment. But the paradox is surely that that kind of approach implies public expenditure of the sort that, if we look at the forward-looking plans that have already been published, is going to be quite hard to achieve because of the 0.9% real terms cut in public spending, which is factored into 2026-7 in the spending review.
That is indeed the case. I think the fiscal outlook is extremely challenging, essentially because of the environment that we're in. We've obviously talked about the fact that the cake is not growing very fast, and if the cake was growing bigger and we had faster productivity growth, that would help. But also, if you're thinking about the demands on the state,
we haven't even talked about the ageing society.
Well, this is what I was going to come
to.
Which
takes the rest of the income. But
precisely, because one of the key challenges is precisely the ageing of the population, increased longevity, which increases, obviously, expenditure on pensions. And we've also taken the decision to increase the generosity of those pensions, and the other thing is healthcare. Now, one of the interesting things about the composition of about public spending, there's obviously a lot of discussion at the moment about the share of spending and the share of taxes being at historically relatively high levels. But there's actually the big picture over the last 50 years is that the share of government spending in GDP hasn't changed very much. It bobbles up and down a bit with the business cycle, and maybe depending on which party is in power. But big picture, government spending has been about 40% of GDP. But beneath the surface, there's a lot going on. So if you go back 50 years, about a quarter of that spending was on health and welfare, including pensions. That's risen to about a half, essentially because of these demographic forces, ageing, and also the nature of technical change in the health sector. Basically, if new treatments are invented that are expensive but they extend life a bit, there's a big demand to make them available. Now, at this point, you might say, well, if the share of those elements has gone from a quarter to nearly a half of government spending. How's that been possible? And the answer is three things have made room for it. Firstly, declines in public investment. Secondly, declines in defence spending. So initially this was the end of empire and then the Cold War dividend. And thirdly, a falling contribution from debt interest. Now, all three of those things which have been helping us have turned round and are going the other way. And on top of that, we have the challenge of dealing with climate change. There's an open question about how much the state may need to play in that role, but potentially there may be more expenditures there. So I see it as an extremely challenging fiscal context, and in that setting, I think to be, if you want to talk about reducing the tax burden, which is a perfectly reasonable objective that some people may want to pursue, you have to explain how you are going to be able to deliver that, which I think requires some significant re-engineering of what the state does at the same time.
It may be that state spending in those circumstances is going to be front-end loaded to trigger the change and to give an indication of direction, which would then give the private sector more confidence to move into the areas that it needed to move into. So it may be that there's a front-end loaded cost which could come down later once the change has been...
But I mean, that is essentially it's an investment. You do something now and it pays off in the future.
Yep. Thank you.
And really the key thing is that that it has to be an action where you're not just trying to kid yourself that it's going to deliver in the future, but you have to have a reasonable confidence that it will help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Danny.
Thank you so much. Such an interesting conversation. Thank you. Let's just carry it on and unpick some of what's been said. Just a first question that does occur to me from your exchange with Angela just now. And I like the thought of being humble and Catholic in our deliberations. This is good. And it's good to have theology mentioned in it as well. On the sort of question of beliefs, and this is, this is an economic forecast, so I'm not asking you to speculate totally metaphysically, but each of you, I'd like to hear whether you think that the net zero policies that the British government is proposing will, within the time frame that we're looking at, which is the next decade or two, help to stimulate economic growth and address some of the challenges around productivity that we've been discussing. That's not to say we shouldn't do them if they don't, but I am interested to know whether you think there is a net cost to net zero, or whether actually it'll be good for our economy. I want to hear from each of you, so whichever wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to pick that up at first pass. So, I mean, I think this is a transition that feels like it needs to happen. It's a transition that is kind of well in train, and it is one in which there is a definite advantage in the sense that these are industries and these are sectors that will, in kind of the immediate term, be more productive. There are places where there's kind of a lot of growth and a lot of development. There are places that use or industries that use high-skilled workers and lots of knowledge for a knowledge economy. So those things straight off the bat will be very good for kind of UK productivity. Now that will take time to feed through as it builds up, but the kind of the immediate analysis would suggest this is a kind of a positive thing in terms of growth, even before you get to the question of, well, what is the alternative if you don't do these? And how does your economy look if you don't do these things, as you fall behind international competitors, as you realise that other places have instituted cleaner fuels, more efficient housing, all of these things. If you find yourself at an international disadvantage, then how that plays out in a relative sense. So I think...
You only see upside to net zero?
No. So I mean, I think that is the kind of the benefit that accrues. I think partly kind of going back to the conversation that Dame Angela and Sir Charlie were having, though, in order to get there is certainly a cost. The transition in of itself has a cost. So the fact that you know you have to get to this endpoint, and the fact that when you get to that endpoint, ultimately that has been a beneficial thing for productivity, for growth, probably for living standards as well, is one thing. But the fact that it takes an investment and a cost, which has to come at the expense of other things, is a near-term cost for a longer-term gain. Now, that said, how you manage that and how extreme that is, I mean, I'm not a climate economist, so it's slightly kind of out of my area of expertise to kind of give advice on how that's managed. But that is certainly the trade-off in the near term, is that there is a redistribution of resources from things that people are currently employed in and that are currently invested in into something which will ultimately give a long-term gain but has a cost of transition. Okay. And so if I think purely from, say, a labour force point of view, currently do we have sufficient people that are skilled in the right industries to a sufficient level to be able to meet that need? Arguably not. And is there a cost of making someone who is currently a kind of a builder on kind of building sites, having to then learn how to retrofit buildings and improve efficiency? There is certainly a cost to that, and there's a personal cost to them. There's a cost to kind of the state of funding it if the state sees so fit. So I think trading that near-term cost against what is unambiguously, in my mind, a longer-term gain is the policy decision.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I would agree with a lot of that. You mentioned specifically a 10-year time horizon, which, if we're talking about forecasting, that can seem like a long period, but in terms of the energy transition, that's not a very long time. And I think certainly within that period of time, I would say net, it would probably be a detriment to growth. But as you yourself mentioned in the wording of the question, that is not a reason to not do it. But all things considered, on that short of a time horizon, I think the policies that are being discussed at the moment and that are planned over the next decade, they aren't designed to boost economic growth. They come from a wider perspective.
So they may have a dampening effect on growth over that time frame, you think?
I don't think a devastating impact on growth, and there is a lot of other things at play. But
so dampening effect.
A dampening, sorry. Yes, I would agree they would have a dampening impact.
Okay, thank you. Right?
One thing I think is important to remember is that GDP is not a measure of welfare in this. So to the extent that you're putting resources into dealing with climate change, you're obviously having an adverse impact on current consumption possibilities and things like that, and current welfare. Nevertheless, you may be raising GDP. I'm not so sure I would think it would necessarily dampen it, but you can be having an effect on GDP, yet nevertheless you can be having an adverse effect on current living standards.
Well, you're imposing that cost on households.
Yes, but the return from that is that further down the road you have a greener economy, and assuming everybody else does it in the world, which is pretty central in this, then you probably have a much better position welfare-wise than if you hadn't done it, when we know there can be some pretty serious costs if global warming continues at the sort of current pace unchecked.
So the long-term economic benefit of net zero will only be felt if we succeed in encouraging the rest of the world to follow suit. Otherwise, it's a cost that we've undertaken for no benefit to ourselves.
That would be true, because basically the UK is not big enough to affect the global stock of emissions.
That's right.
The argument for us doing it is as part of the process of encouraging other countries also to do it. This is basically a collective action. Problem.
But Jack's argument is that there is a direct economic benefit to the transition because it's an industrial strategy, and that's the value of it. It's about improving the productivity, the enterprise of the UK, which will, in time, be beneficial on its own terms.
Yeah, so where I would agree with Sir Charlie is, if we don't get kind of the international community getting behind this agenda, then our ability to be able to stop global warming going beyond the bounds of what's useful is incredibly limited, and therefore, in a very big picture sense, it's futile, because you end up in a world where global warming still happens.
We're poorer.
But even on a kind of a more parochial, narrow view than that, to have a more efficient housing stock that's kind of more energy efficient, to have more highly skilled workers, all of those things mean if there is a future energy price shock and the cost of electricity goes up, UK households will be better than their international partners in being able to meet that.
It would be good to be able to generate more of our own energy, that's for sure, and I agree about the skills. Okay, well, and insulation and so on. So, okay, that's very helpful. Can I come on to questions around the labour market and the effect of the forecasting there? So, quoting from the OBR's outlook in November, they suggest that, and this is a question to anybody who wants to respond, that the two major labour market interventions, as it were, in the autumn statement were the cuts to national insurance and the welfare reforms. And according to the OBR, the cut to NICs will raise employment by 28,000. Sorry, this is in the context, by the way, and the Governor was in here yesterday. We had the Bank of England in. The Governor was pointing out that we're at full employment, as he put it. It's a circumstance of our economy. This is also true that we have 9 million people of working age who are not working. So we might have full employment by one measure, but we also have a very large number of people who are not working. The autumn statement introduced cuts to NICs, which will, according to the OBR, raise employment by 28,000 new people coming into the workforce from inactivity or unemployment. It'll also, according to them, improve current employees taking on more work, equivalent to 94,000 full-time equivalents. So, whatever that is, 125,000 full-time equivalent new workers in the context of a 9 million inactivity rate. It doesn't seem enormous. And likewise, the welfare reforms, according to the OBR, raise employment by 50,000. So these are very welcome changes, but in themselves they don't seem enormous. Or do you think I'm actually not giving sufficient credit to these changes? And actually that is quite significant. But if I'm right that this isn't a great deal, what do you think could be done to increase labour market participation?
Well, certainly I guess there's two things I'll point to that one would like to do something about. One is long-term sickness and getting, I've forgotten exactly what the number, it's 2.8 million or something, is it, long-term sick at the moment out of the labour force. Reintegrating some of those into the labour force. You obviously can't do it for all of them, but making it possible for some of those to participate in the labour force would potentially be very valuable. Another margin which is potentially useful is older workers. One of the consequences of the pandemic was about 500,000 people left the labour force. The previous trend would have actually had it rising by about 500,000. And quite a lot of those workers were older workers. Some of it may be to do with the effect of the pandemic, making people realise their mortality or whatever. But going back to the earlier discussion about ageing and so forth, one of the ways of responding to that is to try and facilitate longer participation in the labour force. So, I'm an old geezer. I'm 70 now, and I'm still participating in the labour force. Yes. So, we need more people doing that.
Yes. Yes. So, and indeed, of course, that is exactly what the government's doing. And I think these measures that I mentioned are intended to have that effect. But to the other two, do you think that we and the OBR specifically correctly estimate impacts on the labour market of these sorts of fiscal decisions? Do you think we're good at predicting labour market effects? I mean, of course, famously, through the pandemic, we expected there to be unemployment at the end of it. In fact, we had the opposite effect. As Charlie says, people didn't want to go back to work. Do you think we're good at predicting labour market effects?
I mean, I would say in general, the OBR and its kind of forecasting performance doesn't appear to be any worse than broadly economic kind of forecasters in the labour market as opposed to anywhere else as well within the economy. I think there's a couple of things at the moment that are posing particular problems. So labour market data at the moment means we're struggling to know where we are, let alone where we are going into the future. And there's an incredible amount of uncertainty and volatility about the data that we're using to put in. It's changing month to month, print to print. So I think, for all forecasters, the OBR included, there's an additional uncertainty in the labour market at the moment. But then I also think there is kind of a particular question around the assumption or kind of the estimates you've just put there, which I would say our own forecast doesn't really see very much of an impact on employment from the policies announced at the last autumn statement in terms of employment. Largely because I think our view, and this is again where judgment comes into forecasting, our view that the sensitivity of people that are currently kind of registered as long-term sick to changes in kind of income levels, especially kind of the income levels we've been talking about in terms of the NICS change, is pretty small. So, we've seen the people that drifted, as Charlie said, into kind of long-term sick. We've seen some of that correct. We've seen people come back in. But the question you really need to ask yourself when you're assessing that policy is, how sensitive are those people that are now in inactivity? How sensitive are they to whether they get an extra penny off of NICS? And our assessment and our judgment in our own forecast was not particularly. The people that have been sensitive had already moved back in. More generally, in terms of policies for labour market and things that would really boost our view of employment in the UK over the next year or two, it's about growing the economy. You can try and bring people in at the margin from inactivity, and that's a very important and admirable thing in terms of inclusivity and in terms of making sure we're using our resources as well as we can. But actually, if you've got an economy that's growing faster rather than stagnating, then people are going to feel more confident as firms taking people on to work. That's going to increase people's incomes, and then that's going to have a virtuous cycle of kind of boosting future employment. So I actually think these things, these type of policies, even on the OBR's estimates, are relatively small.
Wage growth is what's needed.
Well, so I think economic growth is what's needed, and economic growth, especially if it's driven by productivity, can lead to wage growth.
Okay. I'm going to ask you another question, unless you're very keen to jump in on that one.
I can add a few brief points.
Go on.
Right, in terms of the impact from the policies of the autumn statement, we didn't specifically calculate the impact of those, and I think that actually speaks for itself. It's because we didn't think it would have a material impact. In terms of the labour market picture more broadly, I think the furlough example, which you mentioned, is an interesting one and obviously has had a very material impact on the labour market even to now. I think the policy was a success in the sense that it protected livelihoods and is one of the major reasons that there wasn't a bigger spike in unemployment, or really a spike in unemployment. But on the other hand, and I'm not advocating for this, but it is worth considering that if you compare it, for example, to the US approach during the pandemic, which sort of let more of that shock be felt through and didn't protect jobs as much, you could argue that that has in some industries to an extent actually led to productivity gains that here you wouldn't have seen because people were very much shielded to stay in their current roles. So on the one hand, that's certainly a success, but if you're taking a very holistic view in terms of the impact it's had on productivity on the labor market, it's worth considering that as well. And just to echo something that was mentioned a while ago, in our discussion is the point on childcare. I feel like there is a lot of public discourse at the moment which suggests that childcare has sort of been sorted because of the announcements that were made, not at the last fiscal event, but I believe 2 fiscal events ago. But I think, maybe it's a drop in the bucket, but the UK compared to comparable economies still has far, far higher cost of childcare. So, I think the sense that box has been ticked is sort of a
money. There's a lot of money has been put in, but the market remains very inflexible, and therefore the costs are very high for childcare. I think that's
not all of that, of course, is on the government. There are government incentives, for example, for employers to provide employer-organized childcare, which aren't very heavily utilized. So not all of that is on the government, but this sense that we've sort of now addressed that because a lot of money has gone into that direction, I think that's a false sense.
Great. I've got another question or two if we've got time, Chair. Thanks. Nina, I'll sit with you. I mean, the life has got very real, hasn't it, in the last few years? We're suddenly conscious of very significant, as it were, physical realities in our world. And we all started thinking about the Suez Canal and shipping and where are all the container ships and all these kind of questions in a way we hadn't thought about for some years. How good do you think the forecasting industry, and I guess the OBR is the main one, but the bank as well, and private forecasters at modelling supply shocks in general, do you think we or you have learnt anything from COVID, Ukraine, Brexit, in terms of modelling the effect of supply shocks on the UK economy?
We've learned a lot. I don't know that. I know there's been a lot of criticism around various forecasting exercises. I think, in my view, a wrong forecast is one that ultimately leads to a bad policy decision, and then that bad policy decision has negative consequences. I think if we talk about a bad forecast as a forecast that didn't match outturn data, I would be a lot more forgiving, and not just because I run a forecasting agency myself, but I think the past in terms of economic data can be sometimes as uncertain as the future. So you can actually never be sure that you've gotten a forecast correct, because there can always be revisions. I think something like the Bank of England and the forecasting in recent years and the review that's going on now is justified, because that is an example of something where forecasts led to negative consequences, and there should be a review. In terms of modeling shocks, I do think that to some extent private sector forecasters have an advantage over the public sector, because we have a lot more leeway. So if something like a pandemic happens or the energy supply shock, we have a lot more ability to respond quickly by, for example, doing something off model or by applying judgment to a model. And I think that is one of the lessons we've learned, that some things need to be run on a smaller model, because if you're running a model that maybe contains a couple of thousand of equations, your ability to incorporate a change in circumstance is going to be massively reduced. So I think that has been one takeaway, and that's something that the public sector I would expect find harder to integrate.
Are you happy with what you know of Ben Bernanke's review and the terms of reference for that, and what he's doing to try and help the bank? Do you think that is?
I think I have a good understanding of it.
And you think that's all been correctly? He's been correctly commissioned, and he's doing the right sort of work, as far as you know. We don't know what he's going to say yet, but in terms of what he was asked to do you think that the question was the right one?
I think it's a broad brush review, and I wouldn't have specific points of criticism. I think very importantly, it doesn't only look at forecasting practices, but practices around them as well. I think, I would expect that one of the takeaways that's already been mentioned is this difference in the style of communication coming from the Bank of England versus primarily the Fed. So, as a very encouraging sign, I would say that it seems to be taking a very broad brush review rather than just focusing specifically on modelling work.
Okay, great. Last question, and anyone can answer, because it's a very general one, somewhat theological, which is the nation state is re-emerging as a player in the world in a way that, since the end of the Cold War, we'd assumed it. We were going to be a fully globalised economy. We're seeing tariffs go up. We're seeing domestic subsidies return. The UK is still trying to hold on to the idea of being a global trading nation above all. Do you model, and what would be your very high-level predictions of as it were, a retreat to the island of the UK if we were to restrict inward migration, if we were to support domestic manufacturers, if we were to restrict imports, particularly around high carbon emitting countries that we currently don't? A more protectionist UK, what would be your sense of the long-term economic, or indeed short-term economic effects of us following that approach? Go on, Jack.
So I should say, in my role at Barclays, we haven't done kind of specific empirical work on this, but I was fortunate enough to be at the National Institute in 2015, 2016, leading on a lot of their work on kind of trade relationships building up to the kind of the EU referendum. And I think there, having kind of seen that evidence and, the type of thing you're describing there in terms of dislocation of trade agreements, talking about kind of restrictions of free movement of labour, all of those type of things are broadly the same economic principles that we're dealing with then. And I have to say, across a whole range of estimates, across a whole range of scenarios, more frictions in your trading relationships between your big trading partners is negative.
Were you worried then about security of supply, of energy, of food, technology in the way that we are now?
No, so this has been the kind of, I guess, the learning on top of that in the world as it has changed is, partly when we're kind of working with pure economic models and the kind of the pure economics of things, we can follow those models and we can say the economic case is incontrovertible. There's, this is a completely negative thing. I think one of the things that economists across the board have probably learned in the last kind of 5 to 10 years has been that actually there are broader considerations than the kind of macroeconomic kind of is GDP up or is GDP down type things that we tend to look at. And I think some of those kind of more geopolitical concerns or some of those more tail events that could happen, those things are things we've learned to give a bit of weight to. But that is still weighed against what is a relatively broad and deep literature on the fact that actually if you put up...
In a perfect world, lack of friction is good, yes. In the real world, it might help. What do you think, Charlie?
Certainly, in terms of economic efficiency, less frictions are good. But clearly there is a potential trade-off here, which we are now appreciating. That if you want security, if you want resilience, then that may mean foregoing what might be the cheapest, most efficient trade connections. And that maps right back to a hit to GDP and all the things that we know about. So I fully agree with...
Unless we adopt Jack's argument for the net zero policies, which is that investment in our domestic capabilities will have an economic benefit to us in terms of upskilling, in terms of capital investment.
Well, this would be where sort of the new industrial policy comes in. So there may be a dimension to that. I would still think of that as being something which is an offset rather than enough to completely outweigh the adverse effects of essentially investing in resilience. So from a welfare perspective, yes, the right thing to do, but it will have economic consequences.
Sorry. Can I just come back on that in terms of the framing with the kind of the net zero thing? Is those two things obviously don't have to be, they're independent of one another. You can kind of build kind of a more efficient domestic stock of housing and kind of transition without there being some change in your kind of international relationship. Yeah. So just to kind of have clear that actually those two things are independent of one another.
Although we could be making our own solar panels and wind farms rather than...
And that brings the two together, but they don't. It's not a necessary condition. So.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Very interesting.
This has been an absolutely delightful luxury for us to be able to have such wisdom between the three of us today. But I'm just going to, if I may, indulge myself by asking a couple of further questions. Last year, the second half of last year, the US economy grew by 3.8% while their inflation fell. And I just wondered if you'd be kind enough to give us sort of three main reasons why the US economy performed so much more strongly in 2023. Who wants to start with that one?
Okay, Professor I mean, my take on this is, although superficially it might look like the US, the UK and the Eurozone, so let's include that as well, have all suffered from a similar inflation shock, and they've all raised central bank policy rates and so forth. Actually, what has been going on is slightly different in the three jurisdictions. So the US is closer to a conventional cyclical overheating story. You had expansionary fiscal and monetary policies leading into this episode. Obviously, monetary policy moved restrictive, but fiscal policy stayed pretty expansionary. Importantly, the terms of trade shock from the rise in energy prices and so forth, although it has distributional consequences in the US and is bad for US consumers, the US is an energy producer, so it's not made worse off by the consequences of the Ukraine. In the Eurozone, you've got something which is closer to a pure terms of trade shock, the rise in gas, oil prices, food prices, because quite a lot of that comes from the Ukraine and so forth. We sort of had the worst of both worlds. So we've obviously got EU-style terms of trade shock, but there's also a cyclical element, not particularly because of policy choices, but essentially because of the loss of the 500,000 workers as a result of the pandemic, which meant that we came out of the pandemic with a very tight labour market, so essentially overheating. So it looks like the cyclical position that you had in the US.
Net migration's been absolutely enormous in the last 2 years.
Yeah, it doesn't alter the fact that we've had a very tight labour market with vacancies being at historical highs. Admittedly, they're coming down now. Unemployment relatively low. There's obviously question marks about exactly what's happening to the unemployment numbers, but it's clearly pretty low. And indicators of labour shortage are still suggest the labour market is relatively tight. In those circumstances, labour is going to be able to push to get more compensation for the deterioration in living standards associated with the terms of trade shock. And indeed what you see is somewhat higher underlying inflation in this country associated with somewhat faster pay growth here than in the US and the Eurozone. So both of those jurisdictions, the inflation shock is close to being over, particularly in the US. EU's got a bit to go. Here it's less clear. Earnings growth in excess of 6%, settlements running at 5%. Now, Jack's take is that we're going to see that those rates come down swiftly. Personally, I'm less convinced about that, but it's absolutely central to the degree of persistence of inflation going forward, and therefore how long this sort of mildly contractionary monetary stance needs to be maintained to squeeze the excess inflation out of the system.
Okay. Anyone else got any other points about the US economy that haven't been captured?
The only thing I would have put up a lot of those points as the top three. The only thing I would possibly add is I do think we're seeing some fallout from the somewhat different approaches to spending during the pandemic. So the US has spent a lot, the UK has spent a lot. In the UK, there was focus on how, sort of in terms of welfare spending, I already mentioned the furlough scheme. And the US has also spent a lot, but more so in terms of sort of just putting money in people's pockets for them to spend. And I think we are now having, moving on from the pandemic, are sort of still now seeing slightly different fallouts from how those spending packages were structured.
Thank you. Jack, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I'd just build on that. I mean, I think, in your three things, different shock, as Charlie said, entirely. I would say partly it was the terms of trade, difference in nature, but also the UK is still working through supply side shocks that happened in the kind of the years leading up and through the pandemic as well. Then different response, exactly as Nina kind of said. we saw the US fiscal position push much more. But I think that is what has driven essentially a different outcome, importantly for the consumer. So if you look at consumer behaviour in the US, that's what's been driving growth. And in the UK, if you look at kind of private domestic demand through the second half of last year, for instance, it was contracting almost a percentage point, which is a very different, the fact that we were in a recession, even with the government being the driver of kind of spending in the economy, is because you didn't really have that pass through to consumers. So I think that consumer behaviour and the kind of virtuous cycle it creates is a big part of the difference between the UK and the US.
Thank you. And we, just to let you into a secret, we were penciling in Dr. Bernanke for today to come and tell us what he'd put in his report. And now we're being told that we're not going to see that until mid-spring. So I know we heard from you, Nina, on the subject of the Bernanke review. Professor Bean, what are you expecting and when, and what's caused the delay?
Well, I have no idea what's caused the delay. I would assume that once he's written a first draft of his review, he'll discuss it with the governor, other members of the MPC, and the.
What do you think will be in it? Dot plots, communication?
Well, I spoke
change to the compass model.
I spoke to Ben early on in his review and certainly gave my views of what I thought he ought to put in it. One thing I did argue, and I do think would be a good idea, and since I'm not the only person who suggested this, it wouldn't surprise me if it does appear in the review, is a suggestion that the bank should make more use of scenarios. The fan charts are obviously designed to try and convey uncertainty to the reader, but being honest, I think they've been a bit of a heroic failure in that the media, the markets, your good selves focus on the central projection almost exclusively, and particularly with the recent episode, there was a high degree of uncertainty at the outset about how much persistence there would be. And central banks actually took the view there would be relatively little persistence. I think it's turned out to be more than there was. That could be not just talked about, but illustrated with the aid of quantitative scenarios. So that's one explicit thing. It wouldn't surprise me if he recommended more systematic ex post forecast appraisal and deconstruction, looking at forecast errors in the jargon, which the OBR does. It has an annual forecast evaluation report, recently produced a working paper looking at its track record since it was founded. And to do that properly, you have to dig into how much of forecasting errors is due to revisions in the data, inappropriate conditioning assumptions, faulty economic judgment, or just extraneous noise, which is quite a difficult thing to do. Now, the bank already do things like that internally. You sort of have to do it when you're doing forecasts, but actually exposing that to the outside, I think would be helpful in demonstrating that the bank is learning from experience and therefore helps to build credibility. Dot plots, personally, I'm not a big fan of. I think they've actually been a retrograde step in terms of communication. What central banks need to do, what you want them to do, is to be able to communicate their reaction function. That's what you need people to understand. And giving statements about the future path of interest rates, which are apt to be construed as being unconditional promises, I think is heading for a fall. And the dot plots fall a bit in that category. I would instead want to see the effort put into better communication of the reaction function. Scenarios may be an ingredient of that. I'm sure he will also include stuff on how the forecast is conducted internally, the role of the model in that process. Because clearly there has been a bit of a breakdown in terms of the confidence of the MPC in terms of the forecasting framework and its ability to be nimble to dealing with new problems and so forth. So I'm sure he will have some views on those aspects as well.
Thank you. And mid-April, it sounds like, for us. Jack, anything else on that?
I mean, I think so, coming back to Mr. Kruger's point about this being a broad kind of remit, essentially, I think that is by far the biggest benefit of this. So, I mean, I think there's some deep questions that hopefully Dr. Bernanke kind of gets to about what is the forecast for? Is it a communications device for the outcome of the MPC's view? Is it an input into helping them think about their view? Or is it intended to actually be an accurate forecast of the future state of the economy? I think at the moment it's probably trying to be some combination of all those three things, and I think someone like Dr. Bernanke coming in and asking those questions, helping give some guidance on those is incredibly useful, and would bring clarity. I mean, I think probably one of the things that will be useful to see uncovered, which I think falls in the remit, is the big tension, as kind of I see it in the MPC's forecasting process, comes around the fact that you have individually accountable members with individual views on the MPC, but the forecast, as the governor told the committee yesterday, is the best collective judgment of those 9 people. Now, at best, that kind of generates a forecast that arguably no one individual completely believes, and at worst it can drive internal inconsistencies in how that forecast then comes together, especially if you don't have clear views on what it is you're trying to aim for that forecast. So a case in point at the moment might be Catherine Mann's view on kind of the profile of wages may be very different to Swati Dingra's view of wages, but there's one path within the forecast that is the best judgment of both of them and represents neither. And I think actually you need this review to uncover some of those tensions and come up with solutions. I think part of the potential solutions to that, as kind of Charlie has said, is scenarios and simulations. I think a more maybe extreme version that maybe might be considered by Dr. Bernanke, but is by no means a certain I would have thought, is move into a staff forecast. So for people in the market like myself, when we're trying to understand the individual MPC members, the key is, and all the interesting bits are in the differences in how they view the economy. A central view that we know none of them really believe is not much use for us to make our own predictions. So a staff forecast that is independent of the MPC's view could then focus on being an attempt at a good conditional forecast of the economy. And then MPC members individually could bring together their own views with scenarios and explain why they're different. And so for me, and I think markets more generally, that would be a very helpful innovation, and I hope it's under consideration by Dr. Bernanke. But at the very least, I would expect discussion around how you bring out those differences, whether it's kind of scenarios and simulations, or whether it's actually detaching the forecast completely. But yeah, I'm looking forward to what he has to say.
Thank you. And you've obviously all given it a lot of thought. So, final question. It's the 21st of March MPC meeting. You've got a vote. You're going to hike, keep the same, or cut, Jack?
For me, in that situation, I don't think it's clear cut by any means at the moment. But given our read on the economic data, if I were going with no history, I would probably be voting for a cut. Given the fact that that is a long way from where the bank's communications are at the moment, I think I would take a meeting to point to the fact that cuts will come in. And then from May, I would kind of start that cycle, because in the scheme of things, 6 weeks may not be too much. It gives you a chance to lay groundwork. But I do think the economic data is pointing to a world where in the next meeting or two, it actually justifies cuts.
I would certainly be voting to maintain. I wouldn't be thinking about voting to cut until there was evidence to sustain the idea that pay growth was decelerating to rates that were consistent with the inflation target, and I can't see any way that information is likely to be available before the May meeting. You basically need to go through the pay round this year, where the concentration of settlements is January and April.
Nina?
I would probably go for a dovish hold, so voting to hold, but giving some indication in the communications that in the coming months, if the signals are right, that I would be open to vote for a cut.
My colleagues have any further questions? No? Well, then it remains for me to just thank you so much for a very, very interesting session. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. Order. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently in private. 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 The proceeding is currently